They fed the manuscript into the scanner at midnight, an old, stubborn machine humming as if reluctant to disturb what had rested for centuries. The room smelled of beeswax and iron. Monks in brown robes moved like shadows, careful as if sound itself might rip a secret open. At first, it was only pixels, linen fibers, insect trails, the slow decay of human hands. And then the AI began to read what human eyes had long refused to see. What emerged did not fit the tidy lines of history anyone expected. Listen close. This is not just about a missing paragraph or an obscure footnote. What the scan revealed, words, arrangements, a tone, reframed a quiet, dangerous question. What if what we thought sealed away was never meant to be buried? What if it had been kept because speaking it aloud would topple more than beliefs, would fracture institutions, topple reputations, expose the practical machinery of power? There was a line in the newly revealed passage, simple, clean, where the speaker, tired but steady, said, "Do not build your altars of stone and law. Build them from the slow remaking of hearts." It reads like a whisper to dissidents and diplomats alike. To many Western scholars who had expected rhetorical flourishes, it landed as a verdict. The initial leak, a single audio clip captured by an intern who had stayed behind to watch the rendering, went viral in 48 hours. The clip was rough, the translation imperfect, but the cadence was unmistakable. People on 3 continents listened and argued in real time. A theologian on live television said the passage changes the chronology of doctrine. A senator called it irrelevant antiquarianism. A small friend group in a city basement talked about turning the line into a protest slogan before sunrise. And yet, even as newsrooms chewed the novelty, the monks who had guarded the Codex were oddly calm. Their eldest, thin, gray, the skin around his eyes like folded parchment, kept saying something that at first sounded like deflection. Words do not rescue or condemn. The reading of them does. There was a deliberate humility in that phrasing, a refusal to preempt what others might do with the words they protected. Let me halt here for a moment. If you want to follow this excavation of history as it unspools, if you want to stay with the details that the headlines will skip, subscribe and press like. It helps the channel keep deep, quiet work alive. Good. Now, back in the room where the scan continued, the AI did something else. It aligned marginalia, tiny Greek and Ge'ez notes scrawled between lines, with an unusual pattern. The manuscript contained not only teachings, but corrections and, crucially, a response network. In other words, the voice in these pages expected reply. It expected follow-up. It assumed an audience that would think, argue, and fail together. That assumption is the thread that pulls everything taught. Because the pages were not simply mystical aphorisms, they were administrative. Counsel for communities on how to live without weapons. Instructions for dissent without bloodshed. Notes on recognizing the false prophet who would arrive in prayerful clothes and make the poor pay. There were procedural details, how to organize, when to speak, when not to speak, how to protect the vulnerable without creating new oppressions. It is instruction and incision at once. Imagine the effect when modern institutions, those built on precedence, on authority, realized that their playbook had been anticipated and quietly criticized 2,000 years prior. Imagine clerics, lobbyists, philanthropists, and heads of state reading lines that call shams by their actual names: hierarchy, spectacle, taxation of faith. The language is small, but exacting. It shoves a mirror under the chin of systems that had considered themselves inevitable. Predictably, people split into camps. Some declared the manuscript a threat, dangerous, explosive, something that must be contextualized, minimized, retranslated to fit. Others treated it like a lantern in a storm, proof that a different Christianity existed and might be resurrected, quietly, insistently, from beneath the debris of realpolitik. And then there were dozens of in-between positions, all of them noisy. But noise is not the same as understanding. The real story, what made the monks' caution sensible, was not the words themselves, but what they revealed about the human heart. That devotion, in the truest sense, is always a political act. And the manuscript did not romanticize that. It described the slow tactics of resilience, how to tend hidden schools where people learned to read with their hands steady and their mouths quiet, how to make gifts that could not be taxed, how to practice forgiveness when violence seemed the easiest path to change. A reporter asked the eldest monk, "Why keep such documents hidden?" He replied, "Because you do not lock away a map for the clever. You lock away the map when the journey must be chosen." Translation: some truths are dangerous not because they are false, but because their release requires preparation. The preparation takes time, and it takes communities that can hold contradiction. By dawn on the fourth day after the leak, private emails had circulated between universities and major religious institutions. One think tank proposed a conference to discuss how ancient dissent could inform modern governance. A tech CEO suggested an app that would, quote, deliver the inner teachings to a mass audience. A fringe group on a messaging platform started to sell t-shirts with a paraphrase of the new passage. All of it was a reminder. Revelation gets commodified quickly. But beneath the spectacle, a different effect took root. In small towns, in basement gatherings, people began to practice the manuscript's basic exercises. Silence at noon, shared almsgiving that bypassed charity bureaucracies, listening councils where the weakest spoke first and the loudest listened. These were low-tech, deliberate moves, habits that the pages prescribed, because habits change character before they change politics. And so the moral of the early days was not proclamation, but acclamation. Those who expected a single bombshell were disappointed. The manuscript did not annihilate institutions in a flash. Instead, it offered a slow corrosion, harder to see, harder to harness, and far more dangerous to the comfortable because it worked at the roots. The second week after the scan, a scholar in London posted a thread that forced a different kind of attention. He compared the manuscript's prescriptions to smallpox containment plans, parallels in structure: identify, isolate, inoculate. Not biologically, of course, but socially. The manuscript's counsel on quiet guardianship read like a manual to inoculate communities against the contagion of spectacle and power abuse. This analogy horrified and thrilled people simultaneously. The story's edges began to fray. Scholars started to argue less about authenticity and more about application. Can liturgy be a form of civic education? Can prayer be reform? Can repentance, real structural repentance, be coded into the rhythms of a people? These were not rhetorical flourishes. They were questions with fiscal consequences. If repentance required redistribution, who would give up wealth? Who would surrender institutions? Which governments would be willing to facilitate quieter, less visible forms of power? The manuscript was clever about this. It anticipated human greed and proposed safeguards. One passage recommended rotating communal stewardship. Each household entrusted a sacred object for 1 year, then handed it to the next. This rotation prevented accumulation of symbolic authority in any single household. It decentralized reverence until reverence itself became a practice rather than the property of a lineage or office. Consider how radically destabilizing that is to any system built on sacred lineage or institutional permanence. Predictably, the most vociferous opposition came not from atheists, but from some clerical quarters. A few powerful churches described the text as a local curiosity, then erected theological defenses, arguing that local practice should not rewrite universal doctrine. That was a tactical move. Universal doctrine is sticky. It creates a moral monopoly. The manuscript, by contrast, insisted on the local and the relational. That insistence is a weapon against monopolies. Around the 4th month, things took a human turn. A woman from a coastal village, someone whose life would be unremarkable in any headline, began to teach children a simple breathing prayer adapted from the manuscript. Breathe in for 3 counts, name 1 need. Breathe out for 3 counts, name 1 offering. She taught it in the market, then at the harbor, then at the clinic. Parents noticed a shift in children's quarrels, less anger, more negotiation. The local nurse recorded fewer panic attacks. The practices were mundane but additive. Over time, the village had a slightly different temperament. That is how cultural shifts begin, not as revolutions, but as repeated small acts that rewire ordinary days.
And yet, the manuscript's custodians, those same monks, kept refusing metaphors of salvation by revolution. Teach, not convert, the elder would say. Offer practice, not program. This distinction matters because programs can be captured, practices can be formed into habits that persist even if leadership turns corrupt. The US and several European intelligence services took note, not because they feared a sudden insurgency, but because the document suggested a new vector of influence, cultural resilience. It could be harnessed by states seeking stability or by actors seeking to subvert it. So, an intelligence memo asked a pernicious question. Could this religious practice be weaponized to create parallel loyalty networks? The memo read like a cold water splash. Any community-building tool can be converted into a loyalty machine. The manuscript doesn't pretend otherwise. It insists on internal checks. That frankness is the text's genius. It does not romanticize purity. It describes how movements become corrupted, how revolutionary zeal can calcify into new empires. It gives specific warnings. Watch for those who preach purity while taking what they need. Watch for liturgy that elevates certain faces above others. In some ways, the manuscript is less a manifesto than a set of guardrails for the inevitably messy work of remaking power. Practically, the text also introduced an uncomfortable theological nuance, that holiness could be found in administrative prudence. It equated small, boring acts, cleaning, rotating duties, equitable gifting, with spiritual labor. This flattened the spectacle of holiness and made virtue industrial and mundane. People reacted in 2 ways: admiration and boredom. The admiration came from those who'd long suspected sanctity had more to do with fidelity than fireworks. The boredom came from those who wanted theology to remain poetic and dramatic.
Over the months, conspiracies flourished. Some groups claimed the manuscript proved ancient extraterrestrial contacts.
Others claimed it was a forgery concocted to destabilize Christianity. Neither claim stuck for long. The more interesting phenomena were subtler, adjacent traditions. Sufi lodges, small synagogues, humanist circles began borrowing the manuscript's techniques for cultivating listening. The result? Cross-pollination. Where religious tribes had once feared syncretism, they now found practical tools for building more humane institutions. At the same time, money flowed. Foundations announced grants to study the ethical applications of the text. Tech platforms offered translation tools and micro-practice push notifications, daily prompts to perform a 3-minute exercise derived from the manuscript. That is where real ethical friction appeared, when private capital tries to package ancient practice for convenience. Does a meditation app improve the world, or does it monetize interior reform while leaving structural inequities intact? The manuscript itself would have likely scoffed at the idea that a commodity could substitute for communal sacrifice. A small cohort of activists, learning from the text, pioneered slow mutual aid networks. They set up rotating stewardship for medicine in neighborhoods where supply chains failed. They taught children how to de-escalate fights with a single practiced phrase. They avoided grand pronouncements. Their success was not viral. It was local and stubborn. Over time, these networks lowered petty violence and increased trust in places where nothing else had worked. Towards the end of the second year, a scandal erupted. A prominent charity had used the manuscript's language, "serve silently," to justify bypassing oversight and channeling funds into private accounts. The irony was vicious. The manuscript had warned about leaders who cloaked exploitation in piety. Now that exact dynamic had manifested. The scandal was a brutal proof. The work of guarding against corruption is never finished. It is recursive. It requires the very practices the manuscript taught: rotation, transparency, communal accountability. In response, a global convening was hastily organized. Scholars, clerics, civic leaders, survivors of corruption. They drafted a short set of principles that echoed the manuscript, but were designed for modern, legally binding contexts. Mandatory rotation, public ledgers, right to audit clauses, and support networks for whistleblowers. It was imperfect and immediate, a pragmatic attempt to translate ancient counsel into enforceable policy. Whether it would be abused, too, remained an open question. The final scenes are not dramatic in the way history films dramatize. There is no single uprising, no miraculous conversion of institutions. Instead, there is attrition, a steady wearing away of complacency. Small towns change, policies adapt, schools insert practices into curricula. Some nations pass legislation to encourage rotating stewardship in public community centers. Some bishops write about administrative holiness. Language shifts, legal forms change, culture slowly follows. The manuscript had a last set of lines, a closing fragment that the monks had kept folded and then hidden with a ribbon. It read, plainly, "When the seed is sown and watered by the small hands of the willing, it will be no one's property. Guard it, not for yourself, but to let it go." That is a difficult ethic to live by. To build something intentionally, not to own it. To steward, not to control. The phrase became a kind of litmus test. Initiatives that pursued ownership failed more often than those that practiced relinquishment. The experimental mutual aid projects that explicitly mandated rotation and shared stewardship were to the surprise of many, more durable. Power consolidated less often. Wealth was less likely to be siphoned. People were steadier. Of course, this is not utopia. The same human flaws keep returning: envy, sloth, cunning. The manuscript did not fix those, but it provided a methodology, a set of pragmatic countermeasures that reduced the impact of failures when they came. It framed holiness as a set of institutional design problems, solvable in part by humility and habit. That brings us to an uncomfortable conclusion. If ancient counsel can be weaponized, corrupted, or commodified, it can also be translated into resilient practices that blunt harm. The choice between those outcomes is not purely technical. It is moral and political. The manuscript forced that choice into view. It refused to be merely inspirational and demanded to be operationalized. Years later, a historian wrote an essay arguing that the manuscript's most radical gift was not theology, but epistemology. It taught a new way to know change, incrementally, by habits, not headlines. Institutions that learned it did not topple overnight. They softened. They became capable of self-correction. That kind of transformation is boring to the cameras, but lethal to long-standing abuses. The monks eventually returned the fragments to their monastery. Not everyone accepted that decision. Some activists wanted copies released without filters. Some markets wanted apps. Some states wanted a share of the moral capital. The elders stayed with their answer. Keep teaching, but teach slowly. Let communities choose. Protect the process from spectacle. And now, where are we? We have a world that knows a new set of possibilities. Some exploit them, some embody them.
The real drama, the one that will play out over generations, is in what ordinary people choose to make of these small practices. Are they a tool for civic armor or another vanity? Will the rotation of stewardship become a bureaucratic checkbox with no soul? Or will it become a way of living? If you want to see how ordinary people transform public life with tiny, unglamorous habits, if you want more stories like this, stitched with evidence and skepticism, subscribe and press like one more time. It helps support careful work, not spectacle. The manuscript taught one last piercing lesson. History does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and the whisper is a plan. Those whispers require patient ears and steady hands. They demand repetition. They demand, above all, the courage to make change unglamorous. Because unglamorous change is the only kind that lasts. Listen for those whispers. Act where you can. And remember, sacred texts are dangerous not because they reveal mysteries, but because they reveal responsibilities. The real question is not what the manuscript said, but what we will do together with the small, steady acts that make any community humane.